Liberation theology is a significant development that has dramatically impacted the way that Christians think and talk about God and the gospel. It arose within the 1960s, though it has traces far earlier in the radical Christian tradition. It's been deeply challenging for me personally, both for my own faith and my own theology. In this short video, I want to introduce a few points about liberation theology, though, of course, in just 5 minutes, give or take, I won't be able to cover everything. But I do want to note, however, that there are many versions of liberation theology. The two earliest expressions were Latin American liberation theology, especially articulated by Gustavo Gutierrez, who recently passed away at the age of 96, and Black liberation theology, as articulated by James Cone. But more recently, there have emerged a variety of types of liberation theology to the point where it's no longer proper to talk about liberation theology as much as it is to talk about liberation theologies. And so, for example, there are Native American liberation theologies, queer liberation theologies, womanist and feminist theologies, and so on. And so there are 3 points that I want to cover broadly to describe some of the key characteristics of liberation theologies. These 3 points are as follows. Liberation theology is contextual theology. Liberation theology is politically oriented towards liberating the oppressed and marginalized. And 3, liberation theology introduces a new way of being a theologian and a Christian. The church has always talked about the poor and about the importance of charity, but what is distinct about liberation theology is how it is written not to the poor or about the marginalized, but is written from within the context of the oppressed, by and for the oppressed. Jürgen Moltmann once said that reading the Bible with the eyes of the poor is a different thing from reading it with the eyes of a man with a full belly. And so liberation theology emerges out of the specific context of a socio-political and economic oppression, whether that context is proletarian, black, queer, feminist, disabled, etc. Liberation theologies thus criticize what we might call status quo theology, which assumes that theology is a universal language, that God relates in the same way to the poor and to the rich, to the powerful and to the powerless. And in this way, the status quo theology disregards all of the contextual dimensions that are articulated by liberation theologies. And so an important concept in liberation theology is God's preferential option for the poor. This idea emphasizes how God is not a neutral God. God is a God of justice who sides with the poor and the oppressed in their struggles for liberation and for human dignity. And so because God is not a neutral God, we cannot have a theology that is neutral. And the status quo theology typically takes this kind of stance where it accepts the status quo. And liberation theology is an explicit liberating theology that it develops from and for oppressed communities. Theology is not a language game of idle speculation. It has tremendous political and economic implications. Bad theology can quite literally kill. And so liberation theology exposes the ways that theology has been used to further oppress and subjugate the poor and weak, and in contrast, it strives instead to emphasize that theology can and must be a liberating force for justice in the world. As Gustavo Gutierrez writes, this is a theology which does not stop with reflecting on the world, but rather tries to be part of the process through which the world is transformed. This point is reiterated by liberation theologies with a common phrase that is sometimes used by many. Gutierrez uses it, Jose Miranda uses it, but many others. And this phrase is simply this, that to know God is to do justice. And so this emphasizes that there is no sense of theology, which is the knowledge of God, apart from the praxis of theology, which is the act of doing justice. And so this unites the work of theological reflection with political praxis and emphasizes how the theologian's task is not merely to talk about God or analyze the world, but their task is instead to actively participate in changing the world, partnering with God in anticipation of the kingdom of God. And so theology cannot be politically neutral in this sense. It must be contextually located among the poor and marginalized. Theology must take sides. It cannot be neutral. And in that regard, it has to proclaim the gospel of liberation, which is good news to the poor. And so liberation theology is a protesting and prophetic way of doing theology with the explicit goal of liberation. An important point to this is that liberation isn't idealized as a future event, but as something that takes place now for the material conditions, the real life conditions of everyday people who are oppressed. Now, finally, this means that liberation theology introduces a new way not only of being a theologian, but of being a Christian. No theologian or Christian can remain neutral in a situation of oppression, nor can anyone remain passive in the face of injustice. Liberation theologies emphasize the dire need for action, for praxis which is rooted in a concrete analysis of the situation of the oppressed. And so we have to know why the poor are poor in order to make concrete, liberating steps towards ending their oppression. And so in Latin America specifically, this is why a lot of the liberation theologians relied upon a Marxist analysis of class, particularly in the critique of capitalism and imperialism, and using that critique as a tool in order to aid the liberating praxis that was central for Latin American context. And so those 3 points radically challenge and continue to challenge the status quo approach to theology, and I think they summarize fairly well some of the basic differences between a liberation theology and kind of the standard theology that just focuses a little bit more on just God or maybe on ethics, but isn't necessarily explicitly oriented towards this liberating praxis. And so liberation theology remains a controversial subject today, but I think it articulates a necessary challenge that we cannot afford to ignore. And so I hope these points have been helpful for you to understand a little bit about liberation theology. There are, of course, much more insights that I can bring, and I've talked about other liberation theologians on this channel, such as James Cone. But I want to list a few further reading resources in the description below so that you can check that out if you're curious for more information. But for now, I just want to say thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a great day.